The wine glass shattered against the wall behind Rebecca's head, missing her by inches, as crimson liquid dripped down my grandmother's antique wallpaper like blood from a fresh wound. My 68-year old hands weren't shaking from age. They were trembling with pure, concentrated rage that had been building for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. "You want to treat me like a child?" I whispered, my voice deadly calm as shards of crystal crunched under my slippers. "Let me show you what happens when children play with fire." By morning, Rebecca would discover her credit cards frozen, her car repossessed, and her name stripped from every legal document she thought gave her power over my life. The house she would been planning to sell out from under me? I was about to burn her world down from the inside, one calculated move at a time. The nursing home brochures hidden in her bedroom drawer, she would be the one needing care when I finished with her. But you need to hear how a sweet grandmother from Phoenix became a silver-haired assassin who destroyed her daughter. In-law's life with nothing but paperwork and perfectly legal revenge. Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you are ready for this wild ride. And smash that subscribe button on her light, because this story gets darker than a desert storm, and twice as devastating. The Christmas dinner from hell started 3 years earlier. The day I made the biggest mistake of my life, trusting my son's wife with my future. Rebecca Martinez had slithered into our family like a beautiful snake, all glossy black hair and practiced smiles, convincing my lonely son David that she was his salvation after his bitter divorce. What I saw was a predator who would identified her mark. The moment she learned I owned a $500,000 house in one of Phoenix's most desirable neighborhoods. Samuel and I had built this place from nothing back in 1987, when Ahwatukee was still mostly desert and dreams. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, a guest house in the back, and 2 acres of desert landscaping that we would cultivated with our own hands and decades of love. The mortgage was paid off before David graduated high school. The property value had quadrupled since then, and in my grief-clouded judgment after Samuel's death, I would handed it all over to a woman who saw dollar signs where I saw family legacy. The manipulation started small, the way it always does with professional con artists. Rebecca would mention how cramped their apartment was, how little Tyler needed a yard to play in, how expensive rent was becoming in Phoenix. She would sigh wistfully while looking at real estate websites, making comments about starter homes that cost more than most people's entire life savings. "I just wish we could give Tyler the childhood David had," she would say, her voice thick with calculated emotion. Growing up in a real house, with grandparents nearby, feeling like part of a real family. The guilt was expertly applied. Here I was, a widow rattling around in a house too big for one person, while my only son struggled to provide for his new family. What kind of selfish woman would hoard space and security when she could share it with the people she loved most? The day I signed the trust documents, Rebecca had tears in her eyes. "Mom Coleman," she whispered, using the pet name that had made me feel like I was gaining a daughter. "You don't know what this means to us. We will take such good care of everything, and we will take such good care of you." Those words echoed in my mind now as I stood in the wreckage of Christmas dinner, surrounded by the evidence of how thoroughly she would destroyed every promise she would made. Take care of me. She would systematically strip away my independence, my dignity, my very identity, until I was nothing but an inconvenient reminder of the woman who had once owned everything she now considered hers. The guest house had seemed like the perfect solution 3 years ago. My own space, complete privacy, but close enough to help with Tyler and feel connected to family. Samuel had built it for his mother during her final years, installing grab bars and a walk, in shower, making it perfect for an aging woman who wanted to maintain her independence while staying close to family. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly close to family would become under surveillance. Rebecca installed a Ring doorbell that sent alerts to her phone every time I left the guest house. She positioned security cameras around the property under the guise of home protection. But I soon realized they were pointed at my windows, my garden, my tiny front porch, where I like to drink my morning coffee. "It is for your safety, Mom Coleman," she would explain when I questioned the cameras. An elderly woman living alone, even just a few yards away. We worry about falls, medical emergencies, strangers taking advantage. This way we can always keep an eye on you. Keeping an eye on me meant monitoring my every movement, timing my trips to the mailbox, noting when I went to bed and when I woke up. It meant creating a detailed log of my daily activities that she would later use as evidence of my supposed confusion and wandering. The financial control had been implemented with the same careful precision. Rebecca convinced me to consolidate my accounts for easier management, setting up a joint checking account that my Social Security checks were deposited into directly. She took over paying my bills, managing my Medicare paperwork, even handling my prescription pickups. "You shouldn't have to worry about all these confusing systems," she would said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Let me handle the paperwork so you can just enjoy your retirement." Enjoy my retirement by being completely dependent on her for every financial decision, every medical appointment, every interaction with the outside world. She would position herself as my caregiver, my guardian, my lifeline to the modern world that was supposedly too complicated for someone my age to navigate. But I would been balancing checkbooks since before Rebecca was born. I would managed household finances through Samuel's cancer treatments, his lengthy recovery, his eventual death. I would handled estate lawyers and insurance companies and Medicare administrators without breaking a sweat. The idea that I needed a 34-year-old yoga instructor to manage my simple retirement finances was insulting enough. The reality that she was stealing from me while claiming to help made it criminal. The theft had started small. A mysterious account maintenance fee here, an unexplained elderly care surcharge there, $50 from my grocery budget redirected to her personal wellness account, $100 from my Medicare reimbursement that somehow never made it back to my account. Death by 1,000 cuts, each small enough to dismiss as clerical error or confusion. Then came the bigger moves. The life insurance policy I would maintained for Tyler's college fund suddenly had Rebecca listed as the beneficiary instead of David. My car insurance was transferred to her name, making me a secondary driver on my own vehicle. The property taxes on the house I supposedly still owned were being paid from my account. But the mortgage refinancing Rebecca arranged put her name first on all the documents. I discovered the extent of her financial manipulation by accident, when the pharmacy called about a prescription that my insurance had denied. Rebecca had switched my Medicare plan without telling me, choosing a cheaper option that didn't cover my arthritis medication. When I called to straighten out the confusion, the representative informed me that the change had been authorized by my primary caregiver, who had power of attorney for my medical decisions. Power of attorney I would never granted. Documents I would never signed. Decisions I would never authorized. That is when I called Margaret Chen. Margaret had been one of my brightest third-grade students back in 1992, a serious little girl with pigtails and an analytical mind that could solve math problems that stumped kids twice her age. She would grown up to become one of Phoenix's most feared estate planning attorneys, specializing in elder law and financial abuse cases. Her office was downtown in a gleaming high-rise, all glass and steel, and the kind of success that made former teachers' hearts swell with pride. "Mrs. Coleman," she said when I called her office, voice warm with recognition. "What a wonderful surprise. How can I help you?" "Margaret," I said, my voice shaking with shame and anger. "I think I am being robbed by my own family." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then Margaret's voice came back, cooler now, professional. "Can you be more specific?" I told her everything. The financial irregularities, the unauthorized medical decisions, the surveillance cameras, the plans I would overheard for assisted living placement. Margaret listened without interrupting, asking only for clarification on dates and amounts. "Mrs. Coleman," she said when I finished, "what you are describing is a textbook case of elder financial abuse. It is a felony in Arizona, punishable by up to 12 years in prison. But before we can take action, I need you to understand something important." "What is that?" "Fighting back means fighting dirty. Your daughter, In-law isn't going to surrender quietly when she realizes you are onto her scheme. She is going to escalate, probably try to have you declared incompetent before you can expose her crimes. Are you prepared for that level of warfare? I thought about Samuel, about the house we would build together, about the legacy I would almost let a stranger steal from my grandson. Margaret, I said, I spent 40 years dealing with bullies, cheaters, and manipulators in the classroom. I know exactly how to handle people who think they are smarter than everyone else. Good, Margaret replied, because we are about to destroy her life legally and completely. But first, we need evidence. The evidence-gathering phase lasted 6 months and turned me into someone I barely recognized. A silver-haired spy operating in my own home. Margaret had provided me with equipment that would have made James Bond jealous. Tiny cameras disguised as silk flowers, audio recorders built into picture frames, even a smartphone app that could capture conversations from across a room. Every morning, I would slip out to my garden with my coffee and tend to my roses while the recording devices I would planted throughout the house captured Rebecca's phone calls. Her conversations with her mother were particularly enlightening. "She is definitely slipping," Rebecca would say, her voice carrying clearly through the kitchen window, while I crouched behind my tomato plants with my phone recording every word. Yesterday, she asked me 3 times where I would put her reading glasses. I have hidden them in different places, just to see how confused she gets. It is almost sad, really. Almost sad was one way to describe systematically gaslighting a senior citizen. Criminal elder abuse was the legal term Margaret preferred. The financial records were even more damning. Rebecca had set up automatic transfers from my Social Security account to pay for her gym membership, her massage therapy sessions, her organic grocery deliveries. She would open credit cards in my name, using my excellent credit rating to fund her shopping addiction and lifestyle upgrades. The monthly statements were mailed to a P.O. box I would never authorized, keeping me ignorant of debts being run up in my name. Most shocking of all was the life insurance policy. Not only had Rebecca made herself the beneficiary of my $250,000 policy, she would increase the coverage to $500,000 and added an accidental death rider. The premium payments were coming directly from my checking account, meaning I was funding my own murder incentive. "She is not just planning to steal from you," Margaret explained, during one of our clandestine meetings at a coffee shop across town. "She is planning for your death, and with the assisted living arrangements she has been researching, she will not have to wait very long for natural causes to take their course." The assisted living facility Rebecca had selected wasn't the cheerful retirement community she would describe to David. Desert Wind's Memory Care was a warehouse for people with advanced dementia, a place where confused elderly residents were heavily medicated and largely ignored until they died. The monthly cost was astronomical, nearly $8,000 that would come directly from my savings, and the waiting list had a suspiciously high mortality rate. "Average stay is 18 months, Margaret noted, reviewing the facility's statistics. "Most residents decline rapidly due to overmedication and social isolation. It is basically a death sentence with a medical facade." But Rebecca's masterpiece was the guardianship petition she had been preparing in secret. I discovered it by accident when I was looking for a phone charger in David's home office and found a folder labeled Patricia's Future Care. Inside were psychological evaluations I would never undergone, medical assessments from doctors I would never met, and sworn statements from neighbors claiming I would exhibited signs of confusion and memory loss. The neighbors' statements were particularly creative. According to Rebecca's documentation, I would been found wandering the neighborhood in my pajamas false, had forgotten to turn off my stove multiple times, never happened, and had become agitated and confused when asked simple questions about my daily routine. Complete fabrication. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. First, establish a pattern of concerning behavior through manufactured incidents and false documentation. Then, file for emergency guardianship based on immediate danger to my health and safety. Finally, use the guardianship to authorize my placement in memory care, where I would rapidly deteriorate under chemical restraints and social isolation until the problem solved itself. Rebecca had thought of everything, except the possibility that her victim might be smarter than she was. The psychological evaluation I arranged through Margaret was conducted by Dr. Elena Vasquez, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency assessments. For 3 hours, she put me through every cognitive test in her arsenal: memory recall, problem solving, logical reasoning, emotional regulation, basic life skills assessment. "Mrs. Coleman," she said when we finished, "your cognitive function is not only normal for your age, it is superior. Your memory, analytical thinking, and problem-solving abilities would be impressive in someone 30 years younger. Anyone claiming you are incompetent is either grossly negligent or deliberately fraudulent." Dr. Vasquez's written assessment became the cornerstone of our legal defense. 8 pages of detailed analysis documenting my mental clarity, emotional stability, and complete competence to manage my own affairs. It was a medical opinion that would be nearly impossible for Rebecca to challenge, especially since she would have to explain why she would never sought a legitimate evaluation before filing her guardianship petition. Margaret also arranged for a comprehensive financial audit of my accounts. What we discovered made my blood boil. Over the past 3 years, Rebecca had systematically stolen nearly $90,000 from me through various schemes. The money had funded her lifestyle upgrades, her business ventures, even the down payment on a new car she would bought without my knowledge. "This isn't just theft," Margaret explained. "It is organized financial exploitation with intent to defraud. Under Arizona law, it is a Class 2 felony that carries a mandatory minimum sentence. And because the victim is elderly and the amounts exceed $50,000, we are looking at aggravated charges that could put her away for a decade." But the evidence that made me angriest wasn't financial. It was personal. Hidden in Rebecca's laptop, which she would carelessly left open during one of her yoga sessions, were photos of my mother's jewelry, my grandmother's china, and other family heirlooms. Each item had been photographed with price tags and appraisal notes, as if Rebecca was cataloging inventory for sale. She would already sold some pieces. My mother's pearl necklace, the one I would plan to give to Tyler's future wife, had been hawked at a pawn shop for $300. The antique silver tea service that had been in our family for 4 generations was listed on eBay with a starting bid of $50. My wedding dress, stored carefully in the guesthouse closet, had been donated to a thrift store as outdated vintage clothing. Each theft felt like a violation of my family's history, an erasure of the memories and traditions I would hope to pass down to my grandson. But Rebecca wasn't interested in preserving family legacy. She was liquidating it for cash. The worst part was watching David enable her crimes through willful blindness. When I mentioned missing jewelry, he would suggest I would simply misplaced it. When I questioned unusual financial charges, he would remind me that Rebecca was handling everything to make my life easier. When I tried to discuss my concerns about Rebecca's behavior, he would change the subject or suggest I was being paranoid. "Mom, you are just not used to having help," he would say, his voice heavy with the condescending patience of someone explaining reality to a confused child. "Rebecca's trying to take care of you, and you are fighting her every step of the way. Take care of me by stealing from me, lying to me, planning to institutionalize me against my will. Some kind of care." The breaking point came in November, when I overheard Rebecca on the phone with the director of Desert Wind's memory care. "She is becoming increasingly agitated and paranoid," Rebecca was saying, her voice carrying that false concern I would come to despise. "Yesterday she accused me of stealing from her. And this morning she couldn't remember having the conversation. I think it is time to move forward with placement. We have an opening in our secure unit," the director replied, his voice echoing slightly through Rebecca's speakerphone. "It is designed for residents with aggressive tendencies and persecution complexes. Very safe, very contained. The medication protocols we use tend to calm patients down quite effectively." Medication protocols. Chemical restraints to keep troublesome residents quiet and compliant. "How soon could we arrange intake?" Rebecca asked. "As soon as you have the guardianship paperwork completed. Our medical team can provide supportive documentation if you need additional evidence of incompetence." They were planning to drug me into submission based on manufactured evidence and false medical assessments. It was a conspiracy between a predatory family member and a corrupt care facility designed to warehouse elderly people for profit while their assets were systematically looted. That night, I called Margaret and told her I was ready to burn everything down. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Once we start this process, there is no going back. Rebecca's going to realize what is happening, and she will fight dirty." "She is already fighting dirty," I replied. "She has been fighting dirty for 3 years. It is time she learned what happens when you pick a fight with someone who is smarter, meaner, and has nothing left to lose." Margaret's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Mrs. Coleman, I think you are going to enjoy what we have planned for Christmas." The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Christmas dinner would be Rebecca's moment of triumph, her final performance before filing the guardianship papers. She would invite witnesses, her mother, her sister, 2 neighbors who would sign affidavits supporting her claims of my incompetence. They were coming to observe my supposed confusion and decline, providing real-time testimony for her legal case. What they were going to witness instead was the complete destruction of Rebecca's criminal enterprise, broadcast live to an audience of people she would counted on to support her lies. Margaret had spent weeks preparing the legal documentation: restraining orders, fraud charges, eviction notices, criminal complaints, everything needed to dismantle Rebecca's scheme in a single devastating blow. The timing had to be perfect, the evidence presentation flawless, the legal consequences immediate and irreversible. We would also prepared for Rebecca's likely reactions. The security cameras she would install to spy on me had been reprogrammed to stream directly to Margaret's office, and to a cloud storage system that Rebecca couldn't access. When she inevitably lost control and revealed her true nature, it would all be documented in high definition for the courts to review. The night before Christmas, I barely slept, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. For 3 years, I would been forced to play the role of grateful, confused, declining elderly woman. Tomorrow, I would get to be myself again, smart, angry, and completely done with other people's bullshit. Christmas morning dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the mountains like a meteorological omen. I dressed carefully in my navy blue wool dress, the one Samuel had always said made me look distinguished, and pinned my mother's pearl brooch to the collar. If this was going to be my day of reckoning, I wanted to look like someone worthy of respect. Rebecca greeted me at the door with her usual performance of fake warmth, air kissing my cheeks like we were old friends instead of predator and prey. She was dressed to impress in a silk blouse and designer slacks, playing the part of the devoted daughter-in-law who would sacrifice so much to care for her difficult mother-in-law. "Merry Christmas, Mom Coleman," she chirped, her voice pitched high with artificial cheer. "You look lovely. I hope you are excited for our family dinner." Our family dinner, in the house I owned, at the table I would inherited, eating food paid for with money she would stolen from me. But in Rebecca's version of reality, she was the gracious hostess, and I was the grateful guest. The dining room had been transformed into a magazine spread, all coordinated colors and tasteful decorations that bore no resemblance to the warm, lived, in Christmas celebrations Samuel and I used to create. Everything was perfect, sterile, designed for photographs rather than memories. Rebecca's mother arrived first, a thin woman with suspicious eyes who had clearly been briefed on my supposed mental decline. She spoke to me slowly and loudly, as if I were deaf or stupid, asking basic questions about my health and daily routine, while taking mental notes for future testimony. "How are you feeling today, Patricia?" she asked, leaning close and speaking with exaggerated clarity. "Are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" I smiled sweetly and played along. "I am feeling wonderful. Thank you. Though I have been a little forgetful lately, sometimes I cannot remember where I put things." Rebecca's face lit up with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of confused behavior she would been documenting. Her mother nodded sympathetically and patted my hand like I was a well-behaved pet. The other guests trickled in over the next hour. Rebecca's sister, a social worker who would provided professional testimony about my declining cognitive function. The neighbors from across the street, an elderly couple who would sign statements claiming they would witnessed my confused wandering and erratic behavior. David's ex-wife even made an appearance, probably hoping to ingratiate herself with Rebecca's new power structure. Everyone spoke to me with the careful condescension reserved for people considered mentally diminished. They asked simple questions, nodded encouragingly when I gave coherent answers, and exchanged meaningful glances when they thought I wasn't watching. I was being evaluated, assessed, judged by people who had already decided I was incompetent. Tyler, my sweet 8-year-old grandson, was the only person who treated me normally. He hugged me tight and showed me his new video game, chattering excitedly about school and his friends, without the careful monitoring that characterized every other interaction I would had that day. "Grandma Pat," he whispered, while the adults were distracted with appetizers. "Why is everyone being so weird today, out of the mouths of babes?" Even a child could sense the artificial atmosphere, the performance everyone was giving instead of genuine holiday celebration. Sometimes adults make things more complicated than they need to be. "Sweetheart," I whispered back. "But don't worry, things are going to get much simpler very soon." The dinner itself was an elaborate production, with Rebecca playing the perfect hostess while subtly undermining my competence at every opportunity. She served my plate for me, claiming she was helping when I was perfectly capable of serving myself. She monitored my wine consumption, making comments about medication interactions that didn't exist. She even corrected my storytelling when I shared memories of past Christmases, suggesting my recall was confused or inaccurate. "I think you might be mixing up different years, Mom Coleman," she would say with fake gentleness. "That must have been the Christmas when Tyler was younger, not last year." Every correction was delivered with loving concern, but the message was clear. I couldn't be trusted to remember my own experiences accurately. My memories, like my decision-making capacity, were apparently unreliable. The moment I would been waiting for came when I reached for a second dinner roll. I would eaten very little, focused more on observing the dynamics and waiting for my cue. But when my arthritic fingers grasped the warm bread, Rebecca's manicured hand shot out and grabbed my wrist with surprising force. "Let's not overdo it with the carbs, Nana," she said, her voice carrying that sickeningly sweet tone she used when she wanted to humiliate me publicly. "We talked about this with Dr. Martinez, remember? Your blood sugar?" The lie was so bold, so public, so perfectly designed to make me appear confused and forgetful that for a moment I actually admired her audacity. She would never discussed my diet with Dr. Martinez because my blood sugar was perfect, but she would found a way to make me look incompetent while appearing caring and responsible. The dining room fell completely silent. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Tyler stopped playing with his food and looked up with confusion. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how the supposedly declining elderly woman would react to being publicly managed like a child. "Don't touch me." The words came out calm and clear, each one falling like a hammer blow in the suddenly tense room. Rebecca's eyes glittered with triumph. This was exactly what she had been waiting for. The moment when sweet, confused Patricia would lose control in front of witnesses, providing perfect evidence for her incompetence claims. "Now, Nana, let's not get upset over bread rolls," she said, her voice dripping with condescending patience. "You know Dr. Martinez said you need to watch your carbohydrates. I am just trying to help you follow his recommendations." The gasoline had been poured. Now it was time to light the match. "Dr. Martinez never said anything about my diet," I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word, "because my blood sugar is perfect. You lying, stealing, manipulative bitch." The effect was instantaneous and electric. Rebecca's face went white, then red, then white again. Her mother gasped audibly. The neighbors exchanged shocked glances. David dropped his fork with a clatter that seemed to echo in the suddenly charged atmosphere. But I was just getting started. "For 3 years, You have been stealing from me, I continued, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding classrooms full of unruly children. You have forged my signature on insurance claims, intercepted my mail, and convinced my own son that his mother is incompetent while you systematically looted my accounts. Rebecca stood up so fast, her chair toppled backward, the crash startling everyone except me. You are confused, Patricia. You are having one of your episodes. Everyone here can see the only episode here, I interrupted. Pulling out my phone is the end of your criminal enterprise. I pressed play on the audio file I would prepared for this moment. Rebecca's voice filled the room, crystal clear and utterly damning. She will not be a problem much longer. The memory care facility specializes in cases like hers. Once she is in the system, it is amazing how quickly these old people just fade away. 18 months average, and then we will have clear title to everything. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca's mother looked like she had been slapped. Her sister's face drained of color. The neighbors stared in horror at the woman they had been prepared to support. And David looked at his wife with the dawning recognition of someone seeing a stranger's face for the first time. You recorded me, Rebecca shrieked, her carefully maintained mask finally slipping to reveal the monster underneath. That is illegal. You cannot actually. Arizona is a one-party consent state, I said calmly, standing up from the table with the dignity of a woman who had just reclaimed her power. I can record any conversation I am part of. And honey, I have been recording everything for months. That is when Rebecca truly lost control. She lunged at me with fingernails like claws, screaming obscenities that would have shocked a sailor. David caught her around the waist, holding her back while she thrashed and threatened to burn the house down, to destroy me, to make sure I died alone and forgotten. This is exactly why I installed my own cameras, I said conversationally, while Rebecca raged like a caged animal. I knew when you finally snapped, I would want it documented. The wine glass left my hand before I even realized I would thrown it. It wasn't planned, wasn't calculated like everything else I would done. It was pure, primitive rage given physical form, flying through the air like a crimson comet toward the woman who had tried to erase me from my own life. Rebecca dove sideways, the glass exploding against the wall where her head had been a split second before. Wine splattered across the wallpaper Samuel and I had hung together 30 years ago, staining the roses red like drops of blood. You psychotic old bat, she screamed, scrambling away from the broken glass. Did you see that? She tried to kill me. She has completely lost her mind. But instead of the chorus of agreement she expected, Rebecca was met with stony silence. Her witnesses had heard the recording. They would seen her true face. They knew exactly who the real monster was in this room. The only thing I have lost, I said, stepping carefully around the glass shards, is my patience. The rest of me is sharp as a razor, and I am about to prove it. I walked to the antique secretary desk in the corner, the one Rebecca had tried to sell last month, until I reminded her it wasn't hers to sell, and pulled out the manila envelope I would been saving for this moment. David, I said, my voice gentle now because he was still my son, still the boy I would rock to sleep and worried over and loved beyond measure. Come here. He approached slowly, his face pale with shock and dawning understanding. When he was close enough, I handed him the envelope with fingers that were perfectly steady. What is this, Mom? The original deed to this house, showing that I never actually transferred ownership to you and Rebecca, the trust you thought you signed. It was a carefully worded occupancy agreement that I can terminate with 30 days' notice. This house has always been mine, David. I just let you live in it. Rebecca lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers from David's hands. That is not possible. I had lawyers check everything. You cannot. You had Rebecca's friend from yoga class read the documents, I corrected. She is a real estate agent, not an attorney. The woman you should have consulted is sitting in her car outside right now, waiting for my signal. As if summoned by my words, the doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see Margaret Chen standing on the porch in her power suit, briefcase in hand, looking like the avenging angel she would become. "That would be my lawyer," I announced to the room. "Margaret was one of my students 20 years ago. She is now one of the most feared estate attorneys in Arizona, and she has been helping me document Rebecca's crimes for months." David opened the door with shaking hands. Margaret stepped inside, nodded politely to the shocked dinner guests, and handed Rebecca a thick stack of papers. "Rebecca Martinez," she said in her courtroom voice, "you are being served with eviction papers, cease and desist orders, criminal fraud charges, and a restraining order prohibiting you from contacting Patricia Coleman or accessing any of her financial accounts." Rebecca's face went through a rainbow of colors, white to red to purple to green. "This is insane, David. Tell them. Tell them. I am your wife. Tell them I have rights." But David was staring at the deed in his hands, finally understanding the scope of his wife's deception. "Mom," he whispered, "how long have you known?" "Since the day you moved in," I replied softly. "I have been watching, documenting, waiting for the right moment." Rebecca thought she was playing chess with a doddering old fool. She didn't realize she was in a cage with a tiger who had been sharpening her claws for 3 years. Margaret pulled out her tablet and began reading charges like she was announcing Oscar winners. Fraud in the first degree, identity theft, elder abuse, grand larceny, conspiracy to commit false imprisonment, forgery, insurance fraud. The list went on and on, each charge a nail in Rebecca's coffin. "The security cameras you installed to spy on Patricia?" Margaret continued. "They have been recording you too. Every illegal entry into her mail, every forged signature, every conversation about having her declared incompetent. It is all evidence now." Rebecca's mother stood up abruptly, her face gray with shock and horror. "I need to leave. Nancy, call your lawyer. This is..." She looked at her daughter with disgust and walked out without another word. Rebecca's sister followed, shaking her head. "I cannot believe I defended you to the ethics board. I actually told them you were a good person who cared about elderly clients." The neighbors slipped out quietly, probably already planning how they would explain their false statements to the police. Soon it was just family, me, David, Margaret, and the woman who would try to steal my life. "You will not get away with this," Rebecca snarled, but her voice lacked conviction. She could see the walls closing in, could feel the empire she would build on lies and manipulation crumbling around her. "I already have," I replied calmly. "Check your phone, dear. You should have some interesting notifications." Rebecca grabbed her phone with trembling fingers. Her face went white as she scrolled through message after message. "What did you do?" "I took back control of every account you have been stealing from," I explained patiently. "Your credit cards, your car loan, your gym membership, your organic grocery deliveries, all funded by my Social Security checks. As of 10 minutes ago, all of those payments have been reversed." Margaret consulted her tablet. "I should also mention that the IRS has been notified about the unreported income from your fraudulent activities. They will be conducting their own investigation into tax evasion charges." The sound that came from Rebecca's throat was inhuman, a mix of rage and despair that made even Margaret take a step back. "You cannot do this to me. I am family, I have a child. You should have thought about Tyler before you decided to commit felony elder abuse," I said, and for the first time my voice carried real sadness. "That little boy deserves better than a mother who is a federal criminal." David. Rebecca spun toward her husband, desperation making her voice shrill. "Say something, do something. This is your mother destroying our family." But David was looking at me with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman who would raised him alone, who had worked 2 jobs to put him through college, who had given him everything, including the house we were standing in. "No, Rebecca," he said quietly. "You destroyed our family the day you decided my mother was nothing but an obstacle to remove." Margaret checked her watch. "The moving truck I hired will be here in 2 hours. I suggest you start packing, Rebecca. The sheriff's department has been notified, and they will be conducting an escort to ensure you don't damage or steal any property on your way out." Moving truck? Rebecca's voice cracked. For your belongings only, Margaret clarified. Everything else stays here, including Tyler's things. David has already filed for emergency custody based on your documented criminal behavior and the immediate threat you pose to the child's welfare. That is when Rebecca truly lost it. She lunged at me with fingernails like claws, screaming obscenities that would have made a sailor blush. David caught her around the waist, holding her back while she thrashed, and threatened to burn the house down, to destroy me, to make sure I died alone and forgotten. This is exactly why I installed cameras everywhere, I said conversationally to Margaret, while Rebecca raged like a caged animal. I knew when she finally snapped, I would want it documented for the assault charges. 2 hours later, the house was quiet. Rebecca was gone, escorted away by police after trying to slash my garden hoses in a final act of petty revenge. Her belongings were stacked on the sidewalk waiting for the Goodwill truck I would schedule to pick them up. David was upstairs tucking Tyler into the bed he would sleep in every night from now on, in the house that would finally feel like home again. I stood in my kitchen making tea in my grandmother's china pot, surrounded by the life I would almost lost. The wine stain on the wallpaper would need to be cleaned, but I thought I might leave it as a reminder. Evidence of the day I stopped being a victim and became a warrior. Margaret sat at the table reviewing the criminal complaints we would filed. This is the most comprehensive elder abuse case I have ever built, she said with satisfaction. Rebecca's looking at serious federal time, especially with the recorded confessions and the tax evasion charges. What about the money she stole? Every penny will be returned, plus damages and legal fees. Her parents are already liquidating assets to avoid being charged as accessories after the fact. Apparently, they knew about some of the financial irregularities, but chose to look the other way. I nodded, stirring honey into my tea. The golden liquid swirled like liquid sunshine, sweet and warm, and completely mine to enjoy. And the guardianship petition she was planning to file, dead in the water. No judge in Arizona will grant custody to someone facing federal fraud charges. Plus, we have Dr. Vasquez's evaluation confirming your complete mental competency. The evaluation had been Margaret's idea. While Rebecca thought she was building a case for my incompetence, I would been building one for my complete mental clarity. Dr. Vasquez had put me through every cognitive test available and declared my mind sharper than most people half my age. David appeared in the doorway, looking exhausted but relieved. Tyler's asleep. He keeps asking when Mommy's coming home. My heart broke a little for my grandson. Whatever Rebecca's crimes, she was still his mother. And children love even the monsters who fail them. We will get him counseling, I said gently. He will understand when he is older that sometimes protecting children means removing them from dangerous situations. I am so sorry, Mom. David's voice cracked. I should have seen what she was doing. I should have protected you. I stood up and wrapped my son in the same arms that had comforted him through nightmares and heartbreaks and every crisis of his 35 years. You were protecting your family the only way you knew how. Rebecca was very good at manipulation. She fooled a lot of people, not you. I had advantages, I admitted. 40 years of teaching gave me a lot of experience spotting liars and bullies. Plus, I was her target. So I saw her true face when she didn't think anyone was watching. Margaret closed her briefcase and stood to leave. I will file the final paperwork tomorrow. By next week, Rebecca will be legally prohibited from contacting any of you or coming within 500 feet of this property. After she left, David and I sat in comfortable silence, processing the events of the day. The house felt different already. Lighter, cleaner, like a curse had been lifted from every room. What happens now? David asked. Now we rebuild, I said simply. You focus on being a father to Tyler and healing from 3 years of psychological abuse. I go back to being the matriarch of this family, instead of the invisible burden Rebecca tried to make me. And Rebecca, I sipped my tea and considered the question. Rebecca would spend the next several years in federal prison, learning that actions have consequences. Her parents would disown her to protect their own assets. Her friends would abandon her once the truth came out. She would lose everything she would valued: money, status, the illusion of control. Rebecca will learn that when you try to bury someone, I said finally, you would better make sure they are actually dead. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings and media attention. The local news picked up the story of the 68-year-old grandmother who had taken down her daughter-in-law's criminal empire with nothing but patience and careful documentation. Soon, I was fielding calls from reporters, advocacy groups, and other elderly people who would recognize their own situations in my story. The Phoenix Women's Center asked me to speak at their monthly meeting. The ARP wanted to feature my case in their national newsletter. A local television station requested an interview for their senior safety segment. I said yes to everything, determined to use my experience to help others avoid the same trap. The interview that meant the most was with Channel 12's investigative reporter, Sarah Martinez, who specialized in exposing scams targeting seniors. She came to my house with a full camera crew, setting up in the living room where Rebecca had once held court. "Mrs. Coleman," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from me, "what would you say to other seniors who might be experiencing similar abuse, but don't know how to fight back?" I looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the women like me who were being slowly erased by people they trusted. I would say document everything. Trust your instincts, and remember that being older doesn't make you powerless, unless you surrender your power willingly. What was the hardest part of fighting back? Accepting that my own son couldn't see what was happening? I replied, honestly. When the people who should protect you are the ones enabling your abuse, you feel completely alone, but you are not alone. There are people who will help you. You just have to be brave enough to ask for it. Any regrets about how you handled the situation? I thought about Rebecca, probably sitting in a holding cell waiting for her federal arraignment, finally facing consequences for 3 years of criminal behavior. I thought about David, learning to be a single father while processing the extent of his wife's betrayal. I thought about Tyler, confused and hurt but safe now, in a house where truth mattered more than performance. Only that I waited so long to fight back, I said. I spent so much time being grateful for scraps that I forgot I deserved the whole meal. The interview aired during the evening news and was shared thousands of times on social media. My phone rang constantly for days, with calls from other seniors, adult children of aging parents, and professionals who worked with elderly clients. Everyone wanted to know how I would found the courage to fight back, how I would gathered evidence, how I would survive the emotional trauma of being betrayed by family. But the call that mattered most came 3 weeks later, from a woman named Dorothy Hawkins in Tucson. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I watched your interview on the news. My daughter-in-law has been doing the same things to me that Rebecca did to you. I thought I was going crazy." "You are not crazy," I assured her. "You are being manipulated by someone who knows exactly how to make you doubt yourself. But you can fight back, you can win." I am 74 years old. I don't know anything about lawyers or legal papers or Dorothy, I interrupted gently. "I am going to give you Margaret Chen's phone number. She is going to help you the same way she helped me. And I am going to be here to talk you through every step of the process." That conversation led to another, then another. Soon I was running an informal support network for elderly abuse victims across Arizona. Margaret provided legal guidance, while I offered emotional support and practical advice based on my own experience. The women who called me were from every background imaginable. Retired teachers, like myself, former nurses, business owners, homemakers. What they all had in common was the systematic erosion of their autonomy by people who claimed to love them. There was Maria Santos, whose son had convinced her to sign over her house deed for tax purposes, then tried to sell the property out from under her. Janet Williams, whose daughter-in-law was draining her retirement accounts to fund a gambling addiction. Susan Chen, whose family had convinced her doctor she was incompetent so they could control her medical decisions. Each story was different in its details, but identical in its pattern: isolation, financial control, gaslighting. Then institutionalization when the victim became too much trouble to manage. It was an epidemic hiding in plain sight, disguised as family caregiving, but actually representing the systematic abuse of society's most vulnerable members. 6 months after Christmas, I stood in my garden on a warm June morning, watching the desert wildflowers bloom in brilliant patches of orange and purple. The roses Rebecca had tried to destroy were thriving, their blooms larger and more vibrant than ever. The guest house had been renovated into a proper apartment where David was slowly rebuilding his relationship with his children and his integrity. Tyler had adjusted better than expected to his new living situation. Child psychologists had explained that children are remarkably resilient when removed from chaotic environments, and my grandson seemed to bloom in the stability of a household where truth was valued over performance. "Grandma Pat," he said one morning, while we worked together in the garden, "why did Mommy have to go away?" It was a question I would dreaded, but knew would come eventually. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his mother was a criminal without destroying his ability to trust other people? "Sometimes adults make very bad choices," I said carefully, showing him how to deadhead the roses. "Your mommy made choices that hurt people. And when adults hurt people, they have to face consequences. But that doesn't mean she didn't love you. Will she come back?" "Not for a long time, sweetheart. But you have Daddy and me, and we are going to take very good care of you." He nodded solemnly and continued working, accepting the explanation with the matter of fact resilience that children possess. Later, I would give him more details as he grew older and could understand the complexity of what had happened. For now, it was enough that he felt safe and loved. David had filed for divorce immediately after Rebecca's arrest, citing her criminal behavior and the impossible situation her actions had created. The proceedings were surprisingly straightforward, given the overwhelming evidence of her fraudulent activities. She would sign the papers from her jail cell, probably hoping cooperation would help her sentencing. "I keep thinking I should have seen it," David said, one evening as we sat on the patio watching Tyler play with his soccer ball. "All the signs were there. The way she talked about you, the financial control, the isolation tactics. How did I miss all of that?" "Because you wanted to believe your wife was a good person," I replied. "And because she was very skilled at what she did. Rebecca didn't start as a master manipulator. She practiced on other people before she got to us." Margaret's investigation had revealed that Rebecca had a history of targeting elderly relatives and family friends. There was an incident with David's ex-wife's grandmother, whose jewelry had mysteriously disappeared during Rebecca's visits. A suspicious fire at her previous mother-in-law's house that had resulted in a convenient insurance payout. A pattern of behavior that showed clear intent and planning. "She saw you as the perfect mark," Margaret had explained. "A recent widower with an aging mother who owned valuable property. She planned our relationship from the beginning." It was a sobering realization that David was struggling to process. The woman he would married, slept beside, built a life with, had been systematically planning to destroy his mother from their first date. Every conversation about our cramped living situation, every suggestion that I needed help managing my affairs, every comment about my supposed confusion had been calculated manipulation. But David was healing. Slowly, and with professional help. He would started therapy to process the emotional abuse he would endured, because that is what it was. Even if he would been Rebecca's accomplice rather than her primary victim. He was learning to trust his own perceptions again, to recognize red flags he would been trained to ignore. "I used to think being a good husband meant supporting my wife's decisions," he told his therapist during a session I would been invited to attend. "I didn't realize I was enabling abuse by staying silent." The therapist, Dr. Amanda Rivera, nodded sympathetically. "Family abusers rely on other family members to look the other way. They create environments where questioning their behavior feels like disloyalty." "You were manipulated too, David. The difference is that you were manipulated into being complicit rather than being the direct target." It was an important distinction that helped David begin forgiving himself, while still accepting responsibility for his role in enabling Rebecca's crimes. He would have been a victim and an enabler simultaneously, a complex psychological position that required careful therapeutic work to untangle. The legal proceedings moved forward with ruthless efficiency. Margaret had built such a comprehensive case that Rebecca's public defender advised her to accept a plea bargain rather than risk trial. She pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The restitution hearing was particularly satisfying. Rebecca was ordered to repay every penny she would stolen, plus damages, legal fees, and penalties that brought the total to nearly $200,000. Her parents liquidated her inheritance to cover the judgment, effectively disowning her to protect their own assets. She will not be eligible for parole for at least 5 years, Margaret explained after the sentencing. And when she gets out, she will be a convicted felon with no financial resources, no family support, and no professional credentials. She is essentially guaranteed to spend the rest of her life in poverty. It was a harsh justice, but appropriate for someone who would try to steal not just money, but an elderly woman's entire existence. Rebecca had planned to erase me gradually, legally, with medical and legal cover for her crimes. Instead, she would erase herself through her own greed and arrogance. The victory felt complete, but the real satisfaction came from the changes I was able to make in other people's lives. The support network I would started with Margaret's help had grown into a formal nonprofit organization, Desert Defenders, dedicated to protecting elderly Arizonans from financial abuse and exploitation. We offered legal referrals, emotional support, and practical guidance for documenting and reporting abuse. Most importantly, we provided what I would needed most during my ordeal: the knowledge that fighting back was possible and that winning was achievable with the right strategy and support. "You have created something amazing here," Margaret said during our first board meeting, held in the conference room of her law firm. "In 1 year, we have helped recover over $2 million in stolen assets and sent 14 abusers to prison. That is 14 families where elderly members can live with dignity instead of fear." The numbers were gratifying, but the individual stories meant more. Dorothy Hawkins had successfully prosecuted her daughter-in-law and recovered her home. Maria Santos had exposed her son's real estate scheme and protected other elderly homeowners from the same scam. Janet Williams had intervened in her daughter-in-law's gambling addiction and recovered her retirement savings. Each victory represented a woman who would refuse to disappear quietly, who had found the courage to fight back against people who would assumed her age made her powerless. The ripple effects were spreading beyond Arizona as other states began adopting our documentation techniques and legal strategies. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from Tyler, who had grown into a thoughtful 9-year-old with strong opinions about justice and fairness. "Grandma Pat," he said one evening while we worked on his homework, "why do people hurt old people?" It was a profound question from someone so young, reflecting his attempt to understand the world he would been born into. "Some people think that being old means being weak," I explained. "They forget that old people are just young people who have lived longer and learned more. But you are not weak. No, sweetheart, I am not. And neither are any of the women I work with now. We are strong because we have survived things that would break younger people. Age isn't weakness, it is experience." "Is that why you help other grandmas?" "Exactly, because every grandmother deserves to feel safe in her own home, just like every child deserves to feel safe in theirs." He nodded seriously and returned to his math problems, processing the idea that strength could come in forms that weren't immediately obvious. It was a lesson that would serve him well as he grew up. The understanding that appearances could be deceiving, and that real power often came from unexpected sources. 1 year after the Christmas dinner that changed everything, I hosted a different kind of holiday celebration. 20 women from Desert Defenders gathered around the dining room table where Rebecca had once tried to humiliate me, sharing stories and strategies and the kind of laughter that comes from surviving battles you weren't sure you could win. The table was set with my grandmother's china, my mother's silver, and crystal glasses that weren't chipped or hidden away. The meal was prepared in my own kitchen, seasoned with my own spices, served at my own pace without interference or criticism. David carved the turkey with the same careful precision Samuel had taught him decades earlier. Tyler helped serve dessert, proud of his grandmother's transformation from victim to advocate. Even my ex-daughter, in-law, attended, bringing her new boyfriend and a sincere apology for the years she would remain silent about Rebecca's behavior. I knew something was wrong, she admitted privately. Rebecca was always asking questions about your routines, your health, your financial situation. But I thought she was just being caring. She was very good at appearing caring, I replied. That is what made her so dangerous. But the moment that mattered most came when Dorothy Hawkins stood up to speak. She would driven up from Tucson for the celebration, bringing her own daughter, the one who had supported her fight against her abusive daughter-in-law. 6 months ago, I felt invisible, Dorothy said, her voice gaining strength with each word. My own family treated me like I was already gone, like my opinions and feelings didn't matter, because I was old. Patricia taught me that age doesn't make you irrelevant. It makes you experienced, and experience is power if you know how to use it. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, but what moved me most was seeing the recognition in every woman's eyes. We would all been taught that growing older meant growing smaller, taking up less space, asking for less consideration. We would learn instead that maturity could be a weapon if we chose to wield it. Later that evening, after the last guest had gone home and David was tucking Tyler into bed, I stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. The woman who had been humiliated at this same table a year ago felt like a different person, smaller, sadder, apologetic for her own existence. That woman had been conditioned to accept scraps and call them kindness, to mistake control for care, to believe that her decades of sacrifice and hard work had earned her nothing more than a place at the margins of her own life. She had been taught that fighting back was selfish, that causing conflict was worse than enduring abuse. But sometimes the most radical thing an older woman can do is refuse to disappear. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give the world is the full force of our accumulated wisdom, our hard-earned perspective, our absolute refusal to be written off or written over. I dried my hands and walked through the house Samuel and I had built together, turning off lights and checking locks, claiming every room, every corner, every square inch of the space I would almost lost. In the morning, I would wake up in my own bed, in my own home, surrounded by my own choices and my own power. Rebecca's voice still echoed sometimes in quiet moments, telling me I was too old, too much trouble, too expensive to maintain. But now I had other voices too. Margaret's legal expertise, Dorothy's growing confidence, Tyler's innocent faith in his grandmother's strength, David's guilt, driven determination to make amends. Most importantly, I had my own voice again, clear and strong and absolutely certain of one thing. I wasn't done taking up space. I wasn't done mattering. I wasn't done being the author of my own story. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sage and Palo Verde, carrying the scent of rain and possibility. Inside, the house settled into its evening rhythms, every creak and sigh familiar and welcoming. This was home. Not just the building, but the feeling of belonging completely to yourself, of knowing your worth, of refusing to accept less than you deserve. Tomorrow, when another woman called the Desert Defenders hotline, feeling invisible and powerless and forgotten, I would be there to remind her of what I would learn the hard way. You are never too old to fight back, and it is never too late to reclaim your life. The holidays would come again, and I would host them in my own home, at my own table, surrounded by people who valued my presence instead of tolerating it. I would serve dinner on my grandmother's china, pour wine into crystal glasses that weren't chipped or hidden, and take up exactly as much space as I pleased. Because I would learn the most important lesson of all. Respect isn't something you earn by shrinking yourself small enough to fit other people's comfort zones. It is something you claim by standing tall, speaking loud, and refusing to apologize for your own existence. That is a lesson worth sharing. That is a story worth telling. And that is exactly what I plan to keep doing for as long as I have breath in my body and fire in my spirit. What is your story? Have you ever had to fight for your place at your own table? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your courage could be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And don't forget to subscribe to Her Light for more stories of women who refuse to fade quietly into the background. Because every woman deserves to shine, no matter what age the calendar says she is.